You know, there are moments in life when you do something so outrageous, so completely out of character, that you almost don't recognize yourself. I never thought I'd be the woman who would swap her husband's lube for glue, but that's exactly what I did. And if you're wondering how that turned out, let's just say it ended with a frantic call to the fire department, a house full of flashing lights, and my cheating husband and his mistress stuck together in a way neither of them will ever forget. The chaos that followed was something out of a nightmare, or maybe a dark comedy. Neighbors gathered on the lawn, whispering and pointing as the firefighters tried to figure out how to separate the two of them without causing even more damage. I stood there, arms crossed, heart pounding, caught somewhere between humiliation and a twisted sense of justice. The look on my husband's face when he realized what had happened was priceless. But the fallout was far messier than I could have ever imagined. But before you judge me, before you decide whether I'm a villain or a woman pushed too far, you need to know what led me to that breaking point. What kind of betrayal makes a wife risk everything for one shocking act of revenge? What secrets were festering beneath the surface of our marriage, and what happened after the sirens faded and the crowd went home? If you think this is where the story ends, you couldn't be more wrong. This was just the beginning. And trust me, you won't want to miss what happened next. My name is Evelyn, and for most of my adult life, I believed I had built something solid, something real. I met Mark when I was 24, fresh out of college and still clinging to the last bits of youthful optimism. He was charming, attentive, and made me feel like the most important person in any room. Our courtship was a whirlwind. Flowers at my office, late-night phone calls, and promises whispered in the dark. When he asked me to marry him, I said yes without hesitation, convinced that we were meant to weather any storm together. Our early years were filled with the kind of happiness that makes you believe in fairy tales. We bought a small house on a quiet street, painted the walls ourselves, and filled the rooms with laughter and dreams. Mark worked long hours as a sales manager, always chasing the next promotion, while I built my own career in education. We were a team, or so I thought, balancing bills, schedules, and the endless to-do lists that come with building a life. When our daughter Grace was born, I felt our bond deepen. Mark was a doting father, the kind who would get up for midnight feedings and rock her back to sleep. I remember watching him with her, thinking how lucky I was to have found a man who cared so deeply for his family. We made traditions, Sunday pancakes, movie nights, summer road trips. Our home was filled with warmth, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you believe you're safe. But even in those golden years, there were shadows I chose not to see. Mark's job demanded more and more of his time, and he often came home late, smelling of expensive cologne and exhaustion. He'd brush off my questions with a tired smile, promising that the long hours were for us, for our future. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. After all, every marriage has its rough patches, right? I told myself that trust was the foundation of love, and I clung to that belief even as the cracks began to show. There were small things at first, a forgotten anniversary, a missed parent-teacher conference, a sudden interest in his appearance that seemed to come out of nowhere. I'd catch him texting late at night, his phone angled away from me, but when I asked, he'd laugh it off. "Just work stuff, Ev. You know how it is." I tried to ignore the knot in my stomach, the way my mind spun with questions I was too afraid to voice. Still, I held on to hope. I planned our 20th anniversary trip months in advance, imagining us walking hand in hand along the beach, rediscovering the spark that had brought us together. I poured my energy into our home, our daughter, and the life we'd built, determined to believe that love could conquer anything. I wanted so badly for us to be okay, for the story of our marriage to be one of resilience and forgiveness. Looking back, I see now how much I was willing to overlook in the name of keeping our family together. I see the ways I silenced my own doubts, the times I chose peace over confrontation, and the moments I convinced myself that things would get better if I just tried a little harder. I was proud of the life we'd created, but beneath the surface, I was afraid of losing it all, afraid of what I might find if I looked too closely. That's the thing about trust. It's both a gift and a gamble. I gave Mark my trust freely, believing that he valued it as much as I did. I never imagined that the man I loved could betray me so completely, or that I would be forced to choose between protecting my heart and protecting the illusion of our perfect life. But as I would soon learn, even the strongest foundations can crumble when secrets are left to fester in the dark. It was a Thursday evening, the kind that should have been unremarkable. Grace was at a friend's house for a sleepover, and I'd planned a quiet night in, just Mark and me, a rare chance to reconnect. I made his favorite dinner, set the table with candles, and even put on the dress he once said made me look beautiful. I wanted to remind us both of the love we'd built, the life we'd promised each other. Mark was late, as usual. I tried not to let it bother me, telling myself he was probably stuck in traffic or caught up at work. But as the minutes ticked by, my anxiety grew. I texted him a simple "everything okay?" and waited for the familiar chime of his reply. When it finally came, it was short. "Running late. Don't wait up." My heart sank, but I forced a smile, telling myself not to overreact. He'd been working so hard lately. He deserved the benefit of the doubt. I cleared the table, packed away the dinner, and tried to distract myself with a book, but my mind kept wandering. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The house felt too quiet, too empty. I wandered into the bedroom to change, and that's when I noticed Mark's phone on the nightstand. He never left it behind. It was always glued to his hand, a constant companion. I hesitated, torn between respecting his privacy and the gnawing suspicion that had been growing inside me for months. Curiosity won out. My hands trembled as I unlocked his phone. He'd never changed the passcode, a small mercy I clung to as I scrolled through his messages. At first, there was nothing unusual. Work emails, group chats, the usual banter with friends. But then I saw a string of messages from a number I didn't recognize. My breath caught as I read the words. Intimate, flirtatious, unmistakably romantic. Photos, too. Her face, her body, her smile. My world tilted on its axis. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. My vision blurred as I scrolled further, reading the plans they'd made, the secrets they'd shared. It wasn't just a fling. It was a relationship, one that had been going on for months, maybe longer. Every late night, every missed dinner, every lie suddenly made sense. The truth was laid bare, and it was uglier than I could have ever imagined. I sat on the edge of the bed, phone clutched in my hand, and let the reality wash over me. Shock gave way to disbelief, then to heartbreak so sharp it felt physical. I thought of all the times I'd defended Mark, all the times I'd told myself I was imagining things. I thought of Grace, of the family we'd built, of the life I'd worked so hard to protect. It all felt like a cruel joke. I wanted to scream, to cry, to throw something, anything, to make the pain stop. But I just sat there, numb, as the weight of betrayal settled over me. I thought about the woman in the photos, about the lies Mark had told, about the trust I'd given so freely. I wondered how long he'd been planning this, how many times he'd looked me in the eye and lied. The hardest part was realizing how much I still wanted to believe in us, even as the evidence stared me in the face. I wanted to believe there was some explanation, some way to fix what had been broken. But deep down, I knew the truth. The man I loved had betrayed me, and nothing would ever be the same. That night, I lay awake in the dark, listening for the sound of Mark's car in the driveway. When he finally came home, hours later, I pretended to be asleep. I couldn't face him, not yet. I needed time to process, to grieve, to figure out what came next. The life I thought I knew was gone, replaced by a reality I never saw coming. And as I stared at the ceiling, heart pounding, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Looking back, I realized the signs were there all along, scattered like breadcrumbs I was too afraid to follow. At first, they were easy to dismiss, small, almost insignificant things that I chalked up to stress or the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. But as the months wore on, those little moments began to pile up, each one adding weight to the growing knot of anxiety in my chest. It started with Mark's sudden change in routine. He'd always been a creature of habit, predictable in the way he moved through his days. But then, out of nowhere, he began working late more often, coming home long after Grace and I had eaten dinner. He'd offer vague explanations, last-minute meetings, a client who needed extra attention, a project that just couldn't wait. I wanted to believe him. I told myself that his career was demanding, that he was doing it all for us. But the excuses started to sound rehearsed, and the warmth in his voice was replaced by a distant, distracted tone. Then there were the phone calls. Mark had always been open with his devices, leaving his phone on the kitchen counter or the coffee table without a second thought. But suddenly, he became protective, keeping it in his pocket at all times, even taking it with him to the bathroom. If it rang, he'd step outside to answer, his voice low and hurried. When I asked who it was, he'd shrug it off. Just work. Nothing important. But I could see the tension in his jaw, the way his eyes darted away from mine. I tried to push the doubts aside, to trust the man I'd built a life with. But the unease grew, fed by 1,000 little inconsistencies. He started paying more attention to his appearance, buying new clothes and cologne, spending extra time in front of the mirror. He joined a gym, something he'd always resisted, and suddenly had a renewed interest in his health. I wanted to be supportive, to believe that he was just trying to take better care of himself. But deep down, I wondered who he was trying to impress. Our conversations became strained, filled with awkward silences and half-hearted attempts at normalcy. I'd ask about his day, and he'd give me clipped one-word answers. He stopped sharing the little details of his life, the way he used to. I missed the easy intimacy we once had, the feeling that we were a team. Instead, I felt like I was living with a stranger, someone who was always just out of reach. The final straw came one evening when I found a receipt in his jacket pocket. A fancy restaurant across town, a place we'd never been together. The date matched one of the nights he'd claimed to be working late. My heart pounded as I stared at the slip of paper, the evidence of his deception right there in my hand. I wanted to confront him, to demand an explanation, but fear held me back. What if I was wrong? What if I was just being paranoid? I started to notice other things too. The way he'd flinch if I reached for his phone, the sudden influx of late-night texts, the way he'd disappear for hours on weekends with flimsy excuses. I found a lipstick stain on one of his shirts, a color I'd never worn. When I asked about it, he laughed it off, saying it must have been from a hug at work. But the laughter didn't reach his eyes, and I felt a chill run down my spine. My anxiety became a constant companion, gnawing at me day and night. I found myself checking his phone when he left it unattended, searching for clues in his emails and messages. I hated the person I was becoming, suspicious, desperate, always on edge. But I couldn't help myself. The trust that had once been the bedrock of our marriage was crumbling, replaced by a growing sense of dread. I confided in my friend Lisa one afternoon over coffee. She listened quietly as I poured out my fears, her brow furrowed with concern. "You know your gut, Ev," she said gently. "Don't ignore it. If something feels off, it probably is." Her words echoed in my mind long after she left, fueling the war between my heart and my head. I started keeping a journal, documenting every odd behavior, every lie, every moment that didn't add up. It was a way to make sense of the chaos, to see the pattern emerging from the noise. The more I wrote, the clearer it became. Mark was hiding something, and it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The tension between trust and doubt was suffocating. I wanted so badly to believe in the man I loved, to give him the benefit of the doubt. But the evidence was mounting, and I couldn't ignore it any longer. I found myself watching him, analyzing every word, every gesture, searching for the truth behind the mask. At night, I lay awake, replaying our conversations, searching for hidden meanings in his words. I wondered if he could feel the distance growing between us, if he knew how close I was to unraveling the secret he'd worked so hard to keep. I wondered if he cared. The hardest part was pretending everything was normal, keeping up appearances for Grace and the outside world. I smiled at neighbors, made small talk at school events, and hosted family dinners, all while my heart was breaking. I felt like I was living a double life, one foot in the world I'd always known, the other in a reality I was terrified to face. In the end, it was the accumulation of all these moments, the lies, the secrets, the growing sense of isolation, that pushed me to finally seek the truth. I knew that whatever I found, there would be no going back. The life I'd built was teetering on the edge, and all it would take was one final push to send it crashing down. In the quiet moments, when the house was still and the only sound was the hum of the refrigerator or the distant ticking of the hallway clock, I found myself drifting back through the years, searching for comfort in memories that now felt impossibly far away. I would close my eyes and remember the early days with Mark, how he'd make me laugh until my sides ached, how he'd pull me close on chilly nights and whisper promises against my hair. I could still feel the warmth of his hand in mine, the way he'd look at me like I was the only person in the world. Those memories were so vivid, so real, that sometimes I'd forget, just for a moment, how much had changed. But then reality would come crashing back, sharp and cold. I'd remember the way he'd started pulling away, the way his eyes would glaze over when I spoke, as if he was already somewhere else. I'd remember the sting of his indifference, the ache of sleeping beside someone who felt a million miles away. The contrast between what we once had and what we'd become was almost too much to bear. I wondered over and over what I had done wrong. Was it something I said? Something I didn't say? Had I let myself go, become too comfortable, too predictable? I'd stand in front of the mirror, searching for signs of the woman I used to be, the one who was confident, spontaneous, full of life. I saw the lines around my eyes, the gray at my temples, and I wondered if Mark saw them too. I wondered if he looked at me and saw someone who had lost her spark, someone who was easy to leave behind. The pain of betrayal was not just about Mark and the other woman. It was about the way it made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. I replayed every argument, every moment of distance, every time I'd chosen to keep the peace instead of speaking my truth. I wondered if I'd made it too easy for him to drift away, if I'd been so focused on being a good wife and mother that I'd forgotten how to be myself. Sometimes, I'd find myself lost in memories of Grace as a little girl, her chubby hands reaching for mine, her laughter echoing through the house, the way she'd crawl into our bed after a nightmare and snuggle between us. Those were the moments that made everything feel worthwhile. The moments that reminded me why I'd fought so hard to keep our family together. But now, even those memories were tinged with sadness, a reminder of what we were losing. I thought about the future I'd imagined, the trips we'd take when Grace went off to college, the quiet evenings spent together, the sense of partnership that had once been the foundation of our marriage. I'd pictured us growing old side by side, weathering life's storms together. Now, that future felt like a cruel joke, a story I'd told myself to keep the fear at bay. The hardest part was the loneliness. Even when Mark was home, I felt invisible, like a ghost haunting the edges of my own life. I missed the way he used to notice the little things, a new dress, a different perfume, the way I'd rearranged the living room. Now it seemed like nothing I did mattered. I could have disappeared, and I wasn't sure he'd even notice. I tried to fill the emptiness with routines, work, chores, errands, anything to keep my mind occupied. But the ache was always there, lurking beneath the surface. I envied the women I saw at the grocery store, laughing with their husbands, sharing inside jokes, moving through the world as a team. I wondered if they knew how lucky they were, or if they too were hiding cracks beneath the surface. There were moments of anger, too. Hot, blinding flashes of rage that left me breathless. I'd think about Mark's lies, the way he'd looked me in the eye and told me everything was fine, and I'd want to scream. I'd want to throw something, to break something, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. But the anger always faded, leaving only sadness in its wake. Sometimes, late at night, I'd lie awake and imagine what I'd say to him if I had the courage. I'd tell him how much he'd hurt me, how deeply he'd betrayed my trust. I'd ask him if he ever thought about the life we'd built, if he ever missed the way things used to be. I'd ask him if she was worth it, if any of it was worth the destruction he'd left behind. But most of all, I'd ask myself if I could ever forgive him, or if I could ever forgive myself for not seeing it sooner. I wondered if I'd ever be able to trust again, if I'd ever feel whole. The pain was raw, but beneath it there was a flicker of something else, a stubborn, quiet strength that refused to be extinguished. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew I couldn't stay trapped in the past forever. I owed it to myself and to Grace to find a way forward, no matter how hard it might be. The days after I found those messages were a blur of anxiety and sleepless nights. I went through the motions, work, chores, making dinner for Grace, but inside I was a storm. Every time Mark walked through the door, I felt my heart race with a mix of dread and fury. I wanted to confront him, to demand the truth, but I was terrified of what he might say. I kept telling myself to wait for the right moment, but the right moment never seemed to come. One evening, after Grace had gone to bed, I couldn't hold it in any longer. Mark was sitting in the living room, scrolling through his phone, oblivious to the tension radiating from me. I stood in the doorway, clutching the receipt I'd found, my hands shaking. "Mark, we need to talk," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked up, surprised. "What's going on?" I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I found this in your jacket." I held out the receipt, watching his face for any sign of guilt. "You told me you were working late that night. But you were at a restaurant. Who were you with?" For a moment, he just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then he shrugged, too casually. "It was a work dinner, Ev. You know how it is. Clients, networking. I didn't think it was a big deal." I felt my anger flare. "You never mentioned it. And what about the texts? The late nights? The way you guard your phone like it's a state secret?" He rolled his eyes, a gesture that stung more than I expected. "You're being paranoid. I've been under a lot of pressure at work. I don't need you accusing me of things that aren't true." The denial was like a slap. I wanted to believe him, to accept his excuses, but the evidence was overwhelming. "Mark, I saw the messages. I know about her. I know you've been lying to me." His face hardened. "You went through my phone?" "That's a real invasion of privacy, Evelyn." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're really going to turn this around on me? After everything you've done?" He stood up, his voice rising. "I haven't done anything. You're imagining things. Maybe if you spent less time snooping and more time focusing on us, we wouldn't be having this conversation." The argument exploded from there. Accusations, denials, old wounds dragged into the light. I brought up every slight, every moment of neglect, every time he'd made me feel small. He fired back with complaints of his own, blaming me for being distant, for not understanding the pressures he was under. The words flew between us like daggers, each one leaving a fresh wound. By the time it was over, I was shaking with rage and exhaustion. Mark stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind him. I stood in the hallway, breathing hard, my mind racing. I felt betrayed, humiliated, and utterly alone. But beneath the pain, something else was brewing. A cold, clear resolve. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I replayed the argument over and over. I thought about all the times I'd let things slide, all the times I'd chosen peace over honesty. I was done being the victim. If Mark wanted to treat our marriage like a game, then maybe it was time I played by my own rules. The idea came to me in a flash, wild, reckless, and more than a little petty. I remembered the bottle of lube Mark kept in his nightstand, the one he thought I didn't know about. I thought about the glue in the garage, the kind that dried clear and strong. The plan formed in my mind, equal parts desperation and dark humor. I knew it was childish, even cruel, but I couldn't shake the urge to do something, anything, to make him feel even a fraction of the pain he'd caused me. The next day, while Mark was at work, I went to the garage and found the glue. My hands trembled as I swapped the bottles, my heart pounding with a mix of guilt and adrenaline. I told myself it was just a prank, a harmless way to get back at him. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. It was a way to reclaim some small measure of control, to remind myself that I wasn't powerless. All day, I was on edge, jumping at every sound, second-guessing my decision. What if he noticed? What if something went wrong? But the anger inside me drowned out the doubts. I was tired of being the one who suffered in silence. I wanted Mark to feel the consequences of his choices, to understand that betrayal had a price. That evening, Mark came home in a good mood, whistling as he set his briefcase down. He barely looked at me as he headed upstairs to shower. I watched him go, my stomach twisting with anticipation and dread. I wondered if he'd use the lube that night, if he'd even think twice about it. I wondered if he'd be alone, or if he'd sneak out again to see her. Hours passed, and I tried to act normal, making small talk with Grace, tidying up the kitchen, anything to keep my mind off what I'd done. But I couldn't escape the sense that something monumental was about to happen. That the balance of power in our marriage was shifting in ways I couldn't predict. When the call finally came, it was after midnight. Mark's number flashed on my phone, and for a moment I hesitated. Then I answered, my voice steady. "Hello?" His voice was frantic, panicked. "Ev, you need to come, please. I need help." I could hear another voice in the background, a woman's voice, high-pitched and terrified. My heart raced as I realized what must have happened. The glue had worked. Mark and his mistress were stuck together, literally and figuratively. I hung up without a word, my mind spinning. I felt a surge of vindication, but also a wave of guilt. Had I gone too far? Was this really the person I wanted to be? As I sat on the edge of the bed, listening to the distant wail of sirens, I knew there was no turning back. The line between right and wrong had blurred, and I was left to face the consequences of my own actions. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something other than pain. I felt powerful, in control, and ready to face whatever came next. The night that followed was a fever dream of chaos, disbelief, and a kind of dark comedy I never could have imagined for my own life. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone still in my hand, the echo of Mark's desperate voice ringing in my ears. I could picture the scene, him and his mistress, caught in the act, suddenly realizing that something was terribly, hilariously wrong. I almost laughed, but the sound caught in my throat, tangled with guilt and adrenaline. I didn't rush to the scene. Instead, I paced the house, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. What would the neighbors think? What would Grace say if she ever found out? Was this the moment my life truly unraveled, or was it the first step toward something new? I tried to steady my breathing, but my heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. It wasn't long before the sirens arrived, their wail slicing through the quiet night. I watched from the window as the fire truck pulled up to the small apartment complex where Mark had been meeting her. The flashing lights painted the street in garish reds and blues, drawing a crowd of curious onlookers. I could see Mark's car parked out front, and I imagined him inside, frantic and humiliated, trying to explain the unexplainable. I finally made my way over, my steps slow and deliberate. I told myself I was only there to make sure he was safe, but part of me wanted to see the fallout with my own eyes. As I approached, I could hear voices, panicked, urgent, and tinged with disbelief. The firefighters were already inside, and I caught snippets of their conversation as I entered the building. "Ma'am, you need to wait out here," one of them said, blocking my path. I nodded, grateful for the barrier between me and the chaos unfolding just beyond the door. I could hear Mark's voice, pleading and embarrassed, and the woman's muffled sobs. The absurdity of it all hit me in waves. My husband, the man I'd trusted for decades, now the subject of a rescue operation because of my own act of revenge. Neighbors gathered in the hallway, whispering and casting sideways glances. I felt their eyes on me, their curiosity and judgment mingling in the air. I wanted to shrink away, to disappear, but I stood my ground. I was done hiding, done pretending that everything was fine. If this was my reckoning, I would face it head on. After what felt like an eternity, the firefighters emerged, their faces a mix of professionalism and barely concealed amusement. Mark and his mistress followed, wrapped in blankets, their faces flushed with shame. I met Mark's eyes for a brief moment, and in that instant, I saw the full weight of what had happened, the humiliation, the fear, the realization that his secret life had been dragged into the harshest possible light. The woman wouldn't look at me. She clung to her blanket, her eyes fixed on the floor. I felt a strange mix of pity and satisfaction. She was a casualty of Mark's choices, just as I had been. But unlike me, she had chosen to step into the fire. And now she was burned. The firefighters spoke quietly to Mark, explaining the medical steps he'd need to take, the follow-up care, the likelihood that this story would spread far beyond the walls of that apartment. I could see the panic in his eyes, the dawning horror as he realized just how public his humiliation would become. There would be no hiding from this, no way to spin the story or sweep it under the rug. As the crowd began to disperse, I felt the adrenaline drain from my body, leaving me shaky and hollow. I had wanted revenge, and I had gotten it, spectacularly, undeniably, and with consequences I hadn't fully considered. The power I'd felt in the moment of planning had evaporated, replaced by a gnawing sense of regret. Had I gone too far? Had I become the villain in my own story? Mark tried to approach me, his face pleading, but I held up a hand to stop him. "Don't," I said, my voice steady but cold. "There's nothing left to say." He opened his mouth to protest, but the words died on his lips. For the first time, I saw him as he truly was, not the man I'd loved, but a flawed, frightened human being, brought low by his own choices. I felt a strange sense of release, as if a weight I'd carried for years had finally been lifted. I turned and walked away, my head held high, even as my heart ached with the enormity of what had just happened. The night air was cool against my skin, and I breathed deeply, trying to steady myself. I knew that the days ahead would be filled with questions, with judgment, with the slow, painful process of picking up the pieces. But for the first time in a long time, I felt something like freedom. As I made my way home, I replayed the events in my mind, the chaos and the humiliation, the moment when everything changed. I knew I would have to face the consequences of my actions, to answer for the pain I had caused, not just to Mark, but to myself, to Grace, to everyone who had been caught in the crossfire. But I also knew that I was done living in the shadows, done letting fear dictate my choices. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and let the tears come. They were tears of grief, of anger, of relief. I had crossed a line and there was no going back, but in the wreckage of my old life, I saw the faintest glimmer of something new, a chance to rebuild, to reclaim my story, to become the woman I was always meant to be. The days that followed were a blur of shame, exhaustion, and a loneliness so deep it felt like I was drowning. The story spread through our neighborhood like wildfire. By the next morning, everyone seemed to know what had happened. I could feel it in the way people looked at me at the grocery store, the way conversations hushed when I entered a room, the way even old friends hesitated before calling. The humiliation was suffocating. I had wanted Mark to feel the sting of exposure, but I hadn't realized how much of it would land on me, too. Grace sensed something was wrong, though I tried to shield her from the worst of it. She was quiet, withdrawn, watching me with wide, uncertain eyes. I wanted to explain, to comfort her, but how do you tell your child that the life she knew has shattered? I found myself avoiding her gaze, afraid she'd see the guilt and regret written all over my face. I felt like I'd failed her, not just as a mother, but as the person she was supposed to trust most in the world. Mark moved out the day after the incident. He packed a bag in silence, his face drawn and pale. There were no apologies, no explanations, just a heavy, aching silence that filled every corner of the house. I watched him go with a strange mix of relief and sorrow. I had wanted him gone, but the emptiness he left behind was almost unbearable. The house felt too big, too quiet, every room echoing with memories of what we'd lost. The media attention was relentless. A local reporter showed up at my door, asking for a comment. I slammed it in her face, but the damage was done. The story made its way online, twisted and sensationalized, the details exaggerated for clicks and gossip. I stopped checking my phone, stopped reading the news, but I couldn't escape the whispers. Even strangers seemed to know my shame. Friends I'd known for years kept their distance. Some sent awkward texts, "thinking of you," or "let me know if you need anything," but most simply disappeared. I understood in a way. No one wants to be caught in the blast radius of a scandal, but their absence hurt more than I expected. I had always prided myself on being strong, on holding my family together, but now I felt like I was unraveling, thread by thread. Nights were the worst. I'd lie awake, replaying every decision, every word, every moment that had led me here. I wondered if I'd gone too far, if I'd let my anger turn me into someone I didn't recognize. I thought about Mark, about the woman he'd chosen over me, about the years we'd spent building a life that had crumbled in a single, spectacular act of revenge. I wondered if he hated me, if he blamed me for the public spectacle, or if he finally understood the pain he'd caused. I missed the small things most. The sound of Grace's laughter, the comfort of Mark's arms, even if they'd grown cold. The sense of belonging that came from being part of a family. Now I felt like an outsider in my own life, a cautionary tale whispered about behind closed doors. I tried to keep up appearances, to go through the motions, but everything felt hollow. Even the routines that once brought me comfort, cooking, gardening, reading, felt empty and pointless. The isolation was crushing. I stopped answering the phone, stopped responding to texts, stopped leaving the house unless I absolutely had to. I let the mail pile up, let the dishes sit in the sink, let the world shrink down to the four walls of my bedroom. I cried until I was numb, then stared at the ceiling, too exhausted to move. I wondered if I'd ever feel whole again, or if this was the price I'd pay for my moment of vengeance. Regret settled over me like a heavy blanket. I thought about all the ways I could have handled things differently, confronting Mark sooner, seeking help, choosing honesty over revenge. I wondered if there was a version of this story where we could have salvaged something, where Grace wouldn't have to grow up with the memory of her family's implosion. But the past was unchangeable, and all I could do was live with the consequences. In those darkest days, I questioned everything, my worth, my choices, my ability to move forward. I felt broken, unlovable, and utterly alone. But even as I sank to my lowest point, a small, stubborn part of me refused to give up. I didn't know how or when or even if things would get better, but I knew I owed it to myself and to Grace to try. It's strange how, even in the depths of despair, life keeps moving. The sun still rises, the bills still need paying, and the world doesn't pause for your heartbreak. For a while, I let myself drift, numb and directionless, but eventually, the ache of isolation became too much to bear. I realized I couldn't stay hidden forever. I had to find a way to live again, not just for Grace, but for myself. The first step was reaching out, even though it terrified me. I called Lisa, my oldest friend, the one who had always known how to make me laugh even on my worst days. She answered on the first ring, her voice warm and steady. I expected awkwardness, maybe even judgment, but instead she listened. She let me cry, let me rage, let me confess every regret and fear. When I was done, she simply said, "You're stronger than you think, Ev. You always have been. Let's get you back on your feet." With Lisa's encouragement, I made an appointment with a therapist. Sitting in that small, sunlit office, I finally allowed myself to speak the truth out loud. I talked about the betrayal, the humiliation, the guilt over my own actions. I talked about Mark, about Grace, about the woman I used to be and the stranger I'd become. My therapist didn't offer easy answers, but she gave me space to grieve, to process, and to begin forgiving myself. One of the hardest lessons was learning to set boundaries. For so long, I'd defined myself by my roles: wife, mother, caretaker. I'd let Mark's needs, Grace's happiness, and everyone else's expectations come before my own. Now I started to ask myself what I needed. I learned to say no, to protect my time and energy, to let go of the guilt that had weighed me down for years. It wasn't easy. Old habits die hard, and there were days when I slipped back into people-pleasing. But each time I stood up for myself, I felt a little stronger. Closure was another mountain to climb. I knew I couldn't move forward until I faced Mark one last time. We met at a quiet cafe, the air thick with unspoken words. He looked tired, older, the weight of everything that had happened etched into his face. For the first time, I saw him not as the villain of my story, but as a flawed, broken man who had made terrible choices. I told him how much he'd hurt me, how deeply his betrayal had cut. I apologized for my own actions, for the chaos I'd unleashed, but I didn't let him off the hook. I made it clear that I deserved better, that Grace deserved better, and that I was done carrying the burden of his mistakes. Walking away from that conversation, I felt lighter. The anger and resentment that had consumed me for so long began to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of peace. I wasn't healed, not yet, but I was no longer defined by what had been done to me. I was ready to start writing a new chapter. Rebuilding my confidence was a slow, sometimes painful process. I started small, taking walks in the park, cooking meals just for myself, reading books that had nothing to do with self-help or heartbreak. I signed up for a pottery class. my hands clumsy at first but growing steadier with each session. I reconnected with old friends, let myself laugh again, and even allowed the possibility of new friendships to bloom. Most importantly, I began to forgive myself. I stopped replaying every mistake, every harsh word, every moment of weakness. I reminded myself that I was human, that I had done the best I could with what I knew at the time. I let go of the need to be perfect, to have all the answers, to fix everything for everyone else. I learned to sit with my pain, to honor it, but not to let it define me. Grace and I found our way back to each other, slowly and gently. We talked honestly about what had happened, about our fears and hopes for the future. I apologized for the ways I'd let her down, and she forgave me with a grace that humbled me. We started new routines, movie nights, long walks, quiet mornings with pancakes and tea. Our family looked different now, but it was still a family, still built on love. As the weeks turned into months, I felt myself growing stronger, more resilient. I knew there would be setbacks, days when the old pain resurfaced, but I also knew I had the tools to face them. I was no longer the woman who hid in the shadows of her own life. I was learning to stand in the light, to claim my place in the world, to believe that I was worthy of happiness. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, I was excited to see where it might lead. The day of our final confrontation arrived with a strange sense of calm. I had rehearsed this moment in my mind 100 times, what I would say, how I would hold myself, the boundaries I would set. But when the time actually came, I felt less like a woman preparing for battle, and more like someone finally ready to lay down her burdens. I chose a quiet park for our meeting, a place where the world felt open and honest, where I could breathe deeply and remember who I was before all the pain. Mark was already there when I arrived, sitting on a bench beneath a canopy of golden leaves. He looked up as I approached, his face a mixture of apprehension and exhaustion. For a moment, we simply regarded each other, two people who had once shared everything and now stood on opposite sides of a chasm neither of us had wanted to create. I sat down beside him, leaving a careful space between us. The silence stretched, heavy with all the things we'd never said. Finally, I broke it. "Thank you for meeting me, Mark." He nodded, his hands twisting nervously in his lap. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me again." "I wasn't sure either," I admitted. But I realized I needed to. For myself, for Grace, for closure. He looked away, staring at the pond in front of us. "I'm sorry, Evelyn, for everything. I know I hurt you. I know I ruined our family." Hearing those words, I felt a wave of emotions, anger, sadness, relief. But I didn't let them sweep me away. I had come here for truth, not for more apologies. "I need you to understand how deeply you hurt me, Mark. Not just with the affair, but with the lies, the gaslighting, the way you made me doubt myself. I spent months thinking I was crazy, that I was the problem. I lost myself trying to hold us together." He flinched, but I pressed on. "You made choices, Mark. You chose to betray me, to betray Grace, to betray the life we built. And when I finally confronted you, you tried to make it my fault. That's not love. That's cowardice." He swallowed hard, his eyes shining with unshed tears. "I know, I was scared. I didn't want to lose you, but I didn't know how to stop. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that I could fix it before you found out. But I couldn't. I'm so sorry." I let his words hang in the air, feeling their weight. "I'm not here for your guilt, Mark. I'm here for myself. I need you to know that I'm done carrying the blame for your mistakes. I'm done letting your choices define my worth. I deserve better." "Grace deserves better," he nodded, wiping his eyes. "You do. You both do." For the first time, I saw him not as the man who had broken me, but as a flawed human being, weak, afraid, and lost. I felt a strange sense of compassion, not for what he'd done, but for the emptiness that must have driven him to it. But I also felt my own strength, a quiet certainty that I would never let anyone make me feel small again. "I forgive you, Mark," I said softly. "Not because you deserve it, but because I need to let go. I need to move on. I need to be free." He looked at me, searching my face for anger or bitterness, but found only resolve. "Thank you, Evelyn. I hope you find happiness. I hope Grace does too." "We will," I said, and I meant it. We sat in silence for a while, watching the ducks glide across the water, the world moving on around us. There was no dramatic ending, no final outburst or tearful embrace. Just two people finally honest with each other, finally ready to let go. As I stood to leave, Mark reached out, but I shook my head gently. "This is goodbye, Mark. For real this time." He nodded, understanding. "Goodbye, Evelyn." I walked away from that bench feeling lighter than I had in years. The pain was still there, but it no longer controlled me. I had faced the man who had hurt me, spoken my truth, and reclaimed my power. I was no longer a victim of his choices. I was the author of my own story. That night, I went home and told Grace about the meeting. I told her that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and that strength sometimes means walking away. We cried together, but they were tears of release, of hope, of new beginnings. I knew there would be hard days ahead, moments when the old wounds would ache and the memories would sting. But I also knew that I had survived the worst, and that I was stronger than I'd ever believed. I was ready to build a new life, not out of spite or anger, but out of love for myself and for the future I deserved. The confrontation with Mark was not the end of my story. It was the turning point, the moment I chose myself, and in that choice, I found a freedom I never thought possible. In the days and weeks after that final conversation with Mark, life felt strangely quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The chaos and noise that had filled my mind for so long began to fade, replaced by a gentle, unfamiliar calm. I found myself waking up each morning with a sense of possibility, even if it was tinged with uncertainty. The house was still, but it no longer felt haunted by regret. Instead, it felt like a blank canvas, waiting for me to decide what came next. Grace and I settled into a new rhythm, one that was slower and softer than before. We talked more, really talked, not just about the logistics of daily life, but about our feelings, our fears, and our hopes. I apologized to her for the ways I'd let my pain spill over into her world, for the times I'd been distant or distracted. She listened, her eyes wise beyond her years, and told me she understood. "We're both learning, Mom," she said one night as we sat together on the porch, watching the sun dip below the trees. "We're both figuring out how to be okay again." I set new boundaries, not just with Mark, but with everyone in my life. I learned to say no without guilt, to protect my time and energy, to ask for help when I needed it. I stopped answering Mark's late-night texts, stopped letting his problems become mine. When he called to talk about Grace, I kept the conversation focused on her, refusing to be drawn back into old patterns. It was hard at first. Old habits die slowly, but with each boundary I set, I felt a little stronger, a little more in control of my own life. I also reached out to friends I'd neglected during the worst of the storm. Some relationships had faded, but others were waiting for me, ready to pick up where we'd left off. I let myself be vulnerable, sharing my story without shame or apology. I was surprised by how many women nodded in understanding, how many had their own stories of heartbreak and healing. We laughed, we cried, and we reminded each other that we were not alone. Healing was not a straight line. There were days when the grief hit me out of nowhere, a song on the radio, a familiar scent, a memory that surfaced unbidden. But instead of running from the pain, I let myself feel it. I learned that healing isn't about erasing the past, but about making peace with it. I let go of the need for closure, the need for everything to make sense. Some things never would, and that was okay. I found comfort in small routines, morning walks, fresh flowers on the kitchen table, a new book waiting on my nightstand. I started journaling again, pouring my thoughts onto the page, untangling the knots inside me. I wrote about the woman I was, the woman I wanted to become, and the lessons I was learning along the way. One of the biggest lessons was about love, not just romantic love, but the love I had for myself, for Grace, for the life I was building. I realized that love isn't about sacrificing yourself for someone else's happiness. It's about respect, honesty, and the courage to walk away when you're not being valued. I learned that I was worthy of love, not in spite of my scars, but because of them. Letting go was the hardest part. For so long, I'd clung to the idea of what my life was supposed to be, to the hope that Mark would change, that our family would be whole again. But as I released those dreams, I made space for new ones. I stopped measuring my worth by someone else's choices. I stopped waiting for permission to be happy. Grace and I created new traditions: Sunday morning pancakes, movie marathons, spontaneous road trips. We laughed more, worried less, and learned to find joy in the present moment. Our family looked different now, but it was still a family, still built on love and resilience. As I reflect on everything that happened, I feel a deep sense of gratitude, not for the pain, but for the strength I found in surviving it. I am not the same woman I was before, and I wouldn't want to be. I am braver, wiser, and more compassionate, both with myself and with others. I know now that I can weather any storm, that I can rebuild from the ashes, that I can choose my own happiness. The aftermath of betrayal was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one where I am the author, where I get to decide what comes next. And for the first time in a long time, I am excited to turn the page. With each passing week, I felt myself growing lighter, as if I were finally shedding the heavy cloak of shame and regret I'd worn for so long. The pain of betrayal didn't vanish, but it no longer defined me. Instead, I began to see it as a scar, a reminder of what I'd survived, not a mark of what I'd lost. I started to look at my life not as something broken, but as something open, full of possibility. I found joy in the smallest things. I took myself out for coffee on Saturday mornings, sitting by the window with a good book and letting the world pass by. I joined a local yoga class, awkward at first, but soon relishing the feeling of strength in my own body. I signed up for a painting workshop, my hands clumsy with the brush, but my heart full of excitement at creating something new. For the first time in years, I was doing things just for me, not to please anyone else, not to fill a void, but to rediscover who I was beneath all the roles I'd played. New friendships blossomed in unexpected places. At the yoga studio, I met Clara, a retired nurse with a wicked sense of humor and a knack for making everyone feel welcome. We started meeting for walks in the park, sharing stories about our lives, our children, our dreams. I realized how much I'd missed the easy camaraderie of women who understood what it meant to start over. Through Clara, I was introduced to a book club, a group of women who gathered each month to talk about everything from novels to navigating life's messier chapters. Their laughter was infectious, their support unwavering, and I found myself looking forward to those evenings more than I ever expected. Grace, too, was thriving. She made new friends at school, joined the debate team, and even started volunteering at the animal shelter. We cheered each other on, celebrating every small victory. Our home was filled with music and laughter again, the kind that comes from knowing you're safe, loved, and free to be yourself. We created new traditions: Friday night pizza, Sunday hikes, spontaneous dance parties in the kitchen. Our family was smaller, but it was stronger, built on honesty and mutual respect. I learned to trust myself again. I stopped second-guessing every decision, stopped apologizing for taking up space. I set goals for myself, both big and small: run a 5K, travel to a new city, learn to cook a complicated recipe. Each time I accomplished something, no matter how minor, I felt a surge of pride. I was no longer waiting for someone else to validate my worth. I was learning to be my own champion. There were moments of doubt, of course, nights when the loneliness crept in, when the old fears whispered that I wasn't enough, that I'd never truly heal. But I faced those moments with compassion, reminding myself how far I'd come. I allowed myself to grieve when I needed to, but I didn't let the grief consume me. I reached out to friends, to Grace, to my therapist, and let them remind me that I was not alone. As the seasons changed, so did I. I found myself dreaming again, about the future, about love, about the adventures still waiting for me. I started saving for a trip to Italy, a place I'd always wanted to see. I imagined walking through sunlit streets, tasting new foods, meeting new people. The world felt wide open, and for the first time in a long time, I was excited to explore it. I also found purpose in helping others. I volunteered at a local women's shelter, sharing my story with those who were just beginning their own journeys of healing. I listened, I comforted, I offered hope. It was humbling and empowering to see how my pain could be transformed into something meaningful, how my scars could become a source of strength for someone else. Looking back, I hardly recognized the woman I used to be, afraid, uncertain, always putting others first. Now I stood tall, confident in my ability to weather any storm. I knew there would be challenges ahead, setbacks and disappointments, but I also knew I had the resilience to face them. I was no longer defined by what had happened to me, but by how I chose to rise from it. Empowerment, I realized, wasn't about being fearless. It was about moving forward in spite of fear, about choosing hope over despair, about believing in your own worth even when the world tries to convince you otherwise. I was proud of the life I was building, proud of the woman I was becoming. As I looked toward the future, I felt a sense of peace and anticipation. My story wasn't over. It was just beginning, and this time, I was the one holding the pen. As I stepped into my new life, I realized how powerful it was to be seen and understood by others who had walked a similar path. I found myself drawn to spaces, both in person and online, where women gathered to share their stories, their heartbreaks, and their victories. There was a quiet strength in these circles, a sense of solidarity that made even the hardest days feel a little lighter. At the women's shelter where I volunteered, I met women from all walks of life, each carrying her own story of betrayal and survival. Some were just beginning to pick up the pieces, their wounds still raw and their voices trembling. Others had found their footing, their eyes bright with the hard-won confidence that comes from surviving the unimaginable. We listened to each other, offered advice, and celebrated every small step forward. I saw myself in their struggles, and I hoped they saw a glimpse of their own future in my healing. Online, I joined support groups where honesty was the only requirement. I shared my story, the pain, the mistakes, the moments of doubt, and the slow, steady climb back to myself. The responses were overwhelming, messages of encouragement, gratitude, and shared experience. Women from around the world reached out, some just needing to be heard, others searching for hope. I realized that by speaking my truth, I was giving others permission to do the same. I offered what I could, a listening ear, a word of encouragement, the reminder that healing isn't linear, and that it's okay to stumble along the way. I told them what I had learned, that self-worth isn't defined by someone else's choices, that forgiveness is a gift you give yourself, and that it's never too late to start over. In these communities, I found not just support but inspiration. I saw women rebuilding their lives, finding joy in unexpected places, and lifting each other up. Their courage fueled my own. And together, we created a tapestry of resilience and hope. I was no longer alone in my journey. I was part of something bigger, a community of women who refused to be broken, who chose healing, and who believed in the power of sharing our stories to help others find their way. If there's one thing I've learned from this journey, it's that even the most painful endings can become the beginning of something beautiful. Betrayal shattered the life I thought I knew, but it also forced me to look inward, to rediscover my own strength, and to build a future on my own terms. Healing wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick, but every step, no matter how small, brought me closer to the woman I was always meant to be. I hope my story reminds you that you are never alone, no matter how dark things may seem. There is a community out there waiting to support you, to listen, and to lift you up when you need it most. If you're struggling with heartbreak, betrayal, or the challenge of starting over, know that your pain does not define you. You are worthy of love, respect, and happiness, just as you are. I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Have you ever faced a moment that changed everything? How did you find your way forward? Please share your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me continue sharing real stories of resilience, hope, and transformation. And if you're curious about what comes next, about the lessons I'm still learning, the new adventures I'm embracing, and the ways I'm finding joy in unexpected places, make sure to stay tuned. There are more stories to tell, more wisdom to share, and more hope to discover together. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for believing in the power of healing and new beginnings. Until next time, Take care of yourself, and remember, your story isn't over yet.